Look at him. He can barely hold the laser pointer without shaking. Why is the brass wasting our time with a cripple?" The whisper was sharp, cutting through the humid air of the lecture hall like a serrated knife, loud enough to be heard by the front row, but quiet enough to offer plausible deniability. At the front of the room, Instructor Miller stiffened, his back to the class. His empty right sleeve, pinned neatly to the side of his olive-drab sweater, twitched involuntarily, a phantom sensation from a hand that hadn't existed for 50 years. He paused, the dry erase marker hovering over the tactical map, but he didn't turn around. He had learned decades ago that the silence of a man who knows his worth is louder than the noise of a boy who is still guessing at his. But if you believe that true strength isn't about how loud you can bark, but how much you can bear, go ahead and comment respect right now. It takes a warrior to know one, and today, a room full of arrogant cadets is about to get the lesson of a lifetime. 75-year-old Thomas Miller wasn't an imposing figure, not anymore. Time had curved his spine and thinned his hair to a wispy gray, and the jagged scar that ran from his jawline down into his collar hinted at a violence his gentle demeanor seemed to contradict. He was a civilian contractor now, hired to teach advanced tactical maneuvers to the top 1% of the graduating class at the academy. These were the elite, the golden children of senators, the star athletes, the ones who had never tasted failure. And they hated him. They hated that he moved slowly. They hated that he fumbled when he tried to switch slides on the projector with his left hand. They hated that he was a reminder of what awaited them: fragility, age, and loss. To them, he was just Lefty, a derogatory nickname coined by Cadet Barker, the squad leader who sat in the center of the first row, chewing gum with a rhythmic, arrogant snap. "Instructor," Barker called out, not bothering to raise his hand. "With all due respect, this strategy seems dated. Direct frontal assault on a fortified bunker. That's meat grinder tactics. We have drones now. We have precision strikes. This feels like, well, it feels like something from a war you lost." A ripple of laughter moved through the room. It was cruel, efficient, and targeted. Miller slowly turned around. His eyes were watery and blue, framed by deep crow's feet. He looked at Barker, then at the rest of the class. He didn't get angry. He didn't yell. He just looked tired. "Technology fails, Cadet," Miller said softly, his voice rasping like dry leaves on concrete. "Batteries die. Signals get jammed. When the screen goes black, all you have is the man next to you and the will to move forward. This maneuver isn't about the bunker. It's about the spacing of the squad under fire." Barker rolled his eyes, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms behind his head. "Right, the spacing. Look, no offense, but maybe you should leave the spacing to people who can actually hold a rifle. I mean, how are you supposed to demonstrate a breach when you're incomplete?" The room went deathly silent. That was the line. Barker had crossed it, stomped on it, and spat on it. Several cadets looked down at their desks, uncomfortable, but no one spoke up. No one defended the old man. Miller looked at his empty sleeve. He touched the fabric with his left hand, smoothing a wrinkle. The shame in the room was palpable, but it wasn't Miller's shame. It was a heavy, suffocating cloud that hung over the cadets, even if they were too arrogant to feel it yet. Miller opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to dismiss the class, perhaps to finally resign and go home to his empty house and his memories, but the heavy oak door at the back of the lecture hall slammed open. The sound was like a gunshot. Every head snapped to the rear. Standing in the doorway, framed by the harsh hallway light, was General Vance. 3 stars gleamed on his shoulders. He was a giant of a man, 6'4", known as the Iron Bull by the press and Sir by everyone else. He was the commandant of the entire base, a man who ate terror for breakfast, and he looked furious. His eyes scanned the room, bypassing the terrified cadets and locking onto the smirking face of Cadet Barker, which was rapidly losing its color. Vance walked down the center aisle, his boots striking the linoleum with a heavy, rhythmic thud that sounded like a countdown. He didn't stop until he was inches from Barker's face. The general smelled of starch, shoe polish, and suppressed rage. "Did I hear you correctly, Cadet?" Vance's voice was a low rumble, barely above a whisper, which made it infinitely more terrifying than a scream. "Did I hear you question the instructor's ability to handle a weapon?" "Did I hear you mock his sacrifice?" Barker stammered, his arrogance evaporating like mist. "Sir, I was just saying that, practically speaking, the physical limitations—" "Stand up," Vance ordered. Barker scrambled to his feet, knocking his chair over in the process. The general ignored the clatter. He turned to the rest of the class. "You all think you're soldiers," Vance said, his voice rising, filling the room. "You wear the uniform, you polished your boots. You think because you aced a simulation and ran a 6-minute mile, you know what war is. You look at Instructor Miller and you see a cripple. You see a broken old man." Vance walked to the front of the room, standing next to Miller. The contrast was stark. The towering, powerful general and the bent, one-armed instructor. Miller looked down, shifting his weight. "General, it's fine," Miller whispered. "They're just kids. Let it go." Vance looked at Miller, and for a split second the general's face softened. A look of profound sorrow and reverence passed between them, an entire conversation held in a single glance. "No, Thomas," Vance said gently. "They aren't kids. They are dangerous. Because an arrogant soldier gets his friends killed, and they need to know why you're standing here and not buried in Arlington." Vance reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, battered black flash drive. It looked old, the casing cracked. He plugged it into the console on the instructor's desk. The projector screen flickered, blue light washing over the confused faces of the cadets. "This footage was declassified this morning," Vance announced. "For 50 years it was buried under black ink. I had to pull every string in the Pentagon to get it released today, because I had a feeling this class needed a history lesson." The video that appeared on the screen was grainy, black and white, and shaky. There was no sound at first, just the timestamp in the corner, 1968. The camera seemed to be mounted on a helmet or a vehicle. It showed a dense, suffocating jungle. Rain was falling in sheets. Tracers lit up the darkness like angry hornets. The camera jerked violently, and the audio kicked in, a cacophony of screams, explosions, and the distinctive rattle of heavy machine gun fire. The cadets leaned forward. This wasn't a simulation. This was raw, unedited chaos. On the screen, a platoon was pinned down in a muddy crater. They were young, their faces smeared with dirt and blood, their eyes wide with the primal fear of death. And in the center of the frame, shouting orders, was a young sergeant. He was handsome, two-handed, and fiercely alive. He was gripping an M16, returning fire, dragging a wounded soldier to cover. "Recognize him?" Vance asked the class. The cadets looked from the screen to the old man standing at the front of the room. The resemblance was faint, buried under decades of wrinkles, but the eyes were the same. It was Miller. A gasp went through the room. On the screen, the situation was deteriorating. The enemy was closing in. Grenades were landing closer and closer to the crater. The camera panned to a young radio operator, a boy who couldn't have been more than 18, huddled in the mud, crying, clutching a radio handset that had been shot through. He was frozen, paralyzed by fear. "That radio operator," Vance said, his voice thick with emotion, "is me." The room froze. The cadets looked at the general, then back at the screen. The young Miller saw the fear in the young Vance's eyes. He saw the enemy flank advancing. He saw the grenade arc through the air. It was a slow-motion nightmare. The grenade, a dark oval of death, landed directly between the young Miller and the terrified radio operator. There was no time to throw it back. There was no time to run. The fuse was already burning down. The logic of survival dictated that Miller should dive away, save himself. and let the kid take the blast. But the video showed something else. It showed Miller drop his rifle. It showed him lunge, not away from the danger, but directly at it. He didn't just dive. He reached out. He grabbed the grenade and pulled it into his chest, curling his body around it, turning his back to his men, using his own flesh and bone as a shield. He jammed it deep into his right side, covering it with his arm and his torso. The screen flashed white. The audio peaked into a distorted screech. The camera was knocked sideways by the concussion. When the dust settled, the image was blurry. The young sergeant was lying in the mud. His right side was a ruin. His arm was gone. But the radio operator, the young General Vance, was alive. He was scrambling over to the sergeant, screaming for a medic, applying a tourniquet to the stump with shaking hands. The video ended abruptly, cutting to black. The silence in the lecture hall was heavier than the humid air had been. It was a physical weight. No one moved. No one breathed. The only sound was the hum of the projector fan and the soft, rhythmic tapping of rain against the window pane. General Vance pulled the flash drive out. He didn't look at the cadets. He looked at Miller. "He didn't just lose an arm," Vance said, his voice cracking. "He gave it. He traded a piece of himself for my life, and not just mine." 6 other men walked out of that jungle because Thomas Miller decided that his life was less important than ours. Vance turned to face the class. His eyes were wet, but his expression was steel. He spent 2 years in a hospital. He had to learn to write, to eat, to dress himself all over again. He was awarded the Medal of Honor, but he turned down the ceremony because he said he didn't do anything special. He said he just did his job. And then he came here, to teach you ungrateful, arrogant children how to stay alive. Vance walked over to Cadet Barker. The young man was trembling. Tears were streaming down his face, dripping off his chin onto his pristine uniform. The arrogance was gone, burned away by the truth. Barker looked at Miller, really looked at him, for the first time. He didn't see a cripple anymore. He saw a titan. He saw a man who had walked through hell and come back with a smile. Barker stood up, his legs shaking. He stepped out from behind his desk. He walked down the aisle, his eyes fixed on the floor until he reached the front of the room. He stopped 3 feet from Miller. He took a breath, raised his head, and snapped into the sharpest, most rigid salute of his life. His hand vibrated with the intensity of his respect. "Sir," Barker choked out, his voice thick, I'm so sorry. I didn't know." One by one, the other cadets stood up. The sound of chairs scraping back was the only noise. 30 young men and women stood at attention, their hands raised in a salute that wasn't for rank, but for honor. They saluted the empty sleeve. They saluted the scar. They saluted the quiet dignity of the man who had absorbed their mockery with the same stoicism he had absorbed shrapnel. Miller looked at them. His eyes glistened. He blinked rapidly, fighting back the emotion. He wasn't used to this. He was used to being overlooked, to being the old man in the corner. He cleared his throat, lifting his left hand to return the salute, a clumsy, backwards gesture that was somehow perfect. "At ease," Miller whispered. The class lowered their hands, but they didn't sit down. They remained standing, waiting. Miller looked at General Vance. "You didn't have to do that, Jim," he said softly. Vance smiled, a sad, weary smile. "Yes, I did, Tom. I should have done it a long time ago." Miller turned back to the map on the board. He picked up the laser pointer. His hand was steady now. "Spacing," he said, his voice stronger, commanding the room not by volume but by presence. "We were talking about spacing. In that jungle, we were too close. That's why the grenade was a threat to all of us. If we had maintained our intervals, the damage would have been contained. You don't learn these rules from a book. You learn them from ghosts." He looked at Barker. "Cadet Barker, come up here. Hold the map for me. I need 2 hands for this next part." Barker rushed forward, eager, humbled, grabbing the corners of the map as if it were a holy relic. Miller began to teach, and for the next hour, not a single student looked at their watch. They hung on every word, every rasping syllable, terrified that they might miss a piece of wisdom paid for in blood. The lesson ended, but the impact didn't. As the cadets filed out, they didn't rush. They moved with a quiet, somber purpose. Each one paused at the door to nod at Miller, a silent acknowledgement of the debt they now understood. Barker was the last to leave. He stopped at the door, turning back. "Instructor Miller?" he asked. Miller looked up from his notes. "Yes, cadet." "Thank you," Barker said, "for the lesson, and for the general." Miller smiled, a genuine, crinkly-eyed smile. "Get out of here, Barker, and keep your head down." As the room emptied, General Vance remained. He walked over to the window, watching the rain fall on the parade grounds below. "You know they're going to talk," Vance said. "By dinner, the whole base will know." Miller shrugged, packing his briefcase with his one good hand. Let them talk. Maybe it'll make them take the training seriously. Vance turned and placed a hand on Miller's shoulder, right over the scar. "You're a good man, Thomas. The best I ever knew." Miller chuckled, a dry, rusty sound. "I'm just a teacher, Jim. Just a teacher." The two old warriors walked out of the lecture hall together, the lights flickering off behind them, leaving the empty room silent. But it wasn't an empty silence anymore. It was filled with the echoes of a lesson that had nothing to do with tactics and everything to do with the heart. The cadets would graduate. They would go to war. Some would come back, some wouldn't. But none of them would ever look at a wounded veteran the same way again. They had learned that the most damaged vessels often carry the most precious cargo. True heroes don't wear capes. Sometimes they don't even wear a matching pair of gloves. They walk among us, quiet and unassuming, carrying the weight of the world on shoulders that have already borne too much. If this story touched you, if you believe that we should honor those who sacrifice their bodies for our tomorrow, subscribe to the channel. Share this video to remind the world that respect isn't given to the loudest voice in the room, but to the one who stood tall when the sky was falling. Never judge a book by its cover, and never, ever underestimate a soldier who has survived the fire. Until next time, stay honorable.